Welcome to international visas and how payroll should handle them. So let's get started by reviewing what we're going to talk about today, because we've got a lot of information to review in a short period of time. So the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to understand really how immigration visa works. And I go over this briefly, at least just so you have an idea of how the impact of how someone goes about getting a visa. Sometimes just understanding that can be really beneficial for you as a payroll professional, because it just really helps you when you ask people for certain things. You kind of understand why maybe they may have challenges with it or not have challenges with it, but they may tell you they do. So you want to really understand just the basic immigration process. And then we're going to talk about I-94 cards. What are they and what value they have to you as a payroll professional. And then we're going to talk about three main categories of visas. The first one is your non-work visas. So we're going to talk about those because there's a lot of non-work visas that appear to be work-type visas. And because of that, you need to understand what those visas mean and why they're not eligible to work. So I like to give you that list just so you kind of have that reference for you. And then obviously we're going to go through some of the more common work visas that as employers you're going to see. And then we're going to talk about student visas. What are student visas? How do they work? And what's special taxation or special things you need to know about student visas. Then we're going to do a brief review of taxation policies. So what does that mean in regards to you have someone who maybe you're sending outside of the U.S. to another country, or you're sending here to our country? What does that mean? So I'm not going to go too deep into that because obviously that has a lot to do with international payroll, and we could do a whole webinar on just that. But just want you to understand there's two different taxation policies that your company can have and what the difference between those two policies are. Then we're going to talk about non-resident alien taxation. Obviously, anyone who's here in the United States under a work visa is going to fall under a non-resident alien category, meaning that they're here just for a temporary period of time. We're going to really talk about those taxation policies and what you need to know about taxation for those individuals. And then I do like to give you a brief overview of resident alien taxation, just in case you do have someone here who is a resident alien that you need to maybe send out of the country or things like that. How should you handle those? And then obviously when you have U.S. citizens and resident aliens that you're sending abroad, how do you handle those? And then we're also going to have a segment at the end for some question and answers, because this can be a really complicated topic for you. So have that section there for you. So please feel free to keep your questions till then, and hopefully we can get all those questions answered for you during the webinar today. So first, let's talk about what is an immigrant visa. What do you really need to know about visas to make sure that you're handling them properly? So visas are a key to for someone to present themselves at the U.S. border and request entry into the U.S. under a particular visa category. So there's several different categories of visas, but the two main categories is an immigrant visa. Some of you may know this as a green card or a permanent resident card. These are individuals who are, the intent is for them to immigrate into the U.S. The second type of visa is the one we're going to spend majority of our time on today, and that's the non-immigrant visa. So they're here on temporary status. They're here for a particular reason. They're not all work visas. Maybe they're here to be a tourist. Maybe they just come into the States to, be a visitor here in the United States. Some of them are work visas. Some of them are student visas. So there's all kinds of different reasons why individuals come here into the U.S. for a temporary status. And those are the ones where we're going to spend majority of our time on today when we talk through non-immigrant visas. So the important thing that I really want to make sure that is clarified on this slide when you talk about visas is to understand that just because someone has a U.S. visa does not mean they're allowed to work, and it doesn't even mean that they're lawfully here in the United States. Again, the visa is just their key to present themselves to the U.S. border, to request entry at the U.S. border. Now, the next slide, we're going to kind of go over the process, and I think that'll help clarify that. But that's the one point that I want to make sure you understand from this slide. So this slide kind of gives you the detail of what the process is that an individual would take to get an immigrant visa. And there's two really main things that I want to make sure that you get, actually three things that you get out of this slide. And the first is there's many different routes that an individual would take to go through the process to even get the visa. So from a student perspective, sometimes they're using their university or school to assist them in completing paperwork. Sometimes as an employer, you as the employer is actually sponsoring an individual to come to the United States under a particular work visa. So, you know, that would be a different route. And then obviously there's other routes. Again, if someone is coming here to, you know, immigrate here, or if someone's coming here as a visitor, they're going to have a different route to take to get an immigrant visa. So that's why sometimes getting a visa in the United States can be somewhat cumbersome, because depending on the purpose of the reason you're coming to the States will determine really what route you take to request that entry. So once that route is taken, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service is the one that will really issue the approval paperwork for an immigrant visa. So for someone to obtain a visa, you know, and the standards that the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service has around what is eligible to be here in the United States is dependent on the visa and what they do for the approval. But that does come from the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. So once an excuse me, once an individual has their approval paperwork, then they're going to go to the U.S. Embassy in their home country. Once they go there, that's when they will actually get the visa issued to them, is at the U.S. Embassy. Then the individual is going to travel to the U.S. border. Once they get to the U.S. border, the State Department at that point is going to issue them what's called an I-94 card. And this is a very important card from a payroll perspective. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this card actually is. So what is an I-94 card? So an I-94 card is the employee's actual entry document into the U.S. Once they're issued an I-94 card, the individual is obviously allowed to be here in the United States. So if someone says to you, well, I don't have an I-94 card, that would be inaccurate. Every state will issue that at the state border upon the approval paperwork and the visa paperwork that they're given at the time of entry. Their I-94 card is their actual ID here in the United States. So an individual, when they come into the United States under a visa, they're told at the state border that the I-94 card that's being issued to them is for identification purposes, and they are required to keep this document on them at all times. It's like us here in the States carrying our driver's license or our IDs with us. So it is a very important card for this individual. The I-94 card is the quote-unquote actual work permit and resident document for a non-immigrant in the U.S. So this may be a little bit confusing because at first I told you that the visa is the key to present themselves. But the visa type actually tells you the purpose that someone has in the United States. But the I-94 card is their actual permit to work. So as you can see, as I go through today's webinar, one of the best practices I'm going to suggest to you is to get a copy of both the I-94 card and the visa. And the reason I'm going to tell you that is because together these documents give you a story of what the purpose the individual has here in the States and that they're lawful to be here and work here in the United States. So these two documents are a critical part of your hire process. Now be careful. When you ask for an I-94 card and the individual's visa, you want to make sure that you clarify that you're asking for these documents for payroll purposes only. Obviously, from an I-9 perspective, you cannot request specific documents. It's unlawful here in the United States. So make sure that that I-9 process is separate. That individual can use these type of documents for the I-9, but that is up to them if these are the documents that they choose to give you. So just be aware of that. The I-94 card is very important in this process. The I-94 card is issued to those presenting themselves with a visa to the State Department at the border. So again, the I-94 card is not issued by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. They're taking care of the visa portion. The I-94 card itself is being issued by the State Departments here in the United States. So here's a list of temporary visas that are not eligible to work. And the reason I give you this list, and I told you this towards the beginning of the webinar, is it's very easy to confuse these visas. So I put this in here for a lot of clarity for you. So first of all, the B1 visa, visitors for business or pleasure, we're going to dive into that one a little bit more because that can be somewhat confusing. Obviously, they're visitors here for business, so if they're working in the United States because they're here for business, isn't that a work visa? So we're going to talk about that one a little bit separately just so that you have a little bit more clarity around that B1 visa. B2 visas is tourist. That one's nice and easy. Obviously, if they're a tourist in the United States, they're not eligible to work. Where the confusion falls is the F visas, the H visas, the J visas. These can be somewhat confusing, and the reason being is we're going to talk about the H visa. We're going to talk about the H1 visa because it's the most common visa issued for work purposes. So obviously, if you say, well, H visas are a work visa, that's not really correct. It's correct that an H1, H2, or H3 visa are work visas, but an H4 visa is issued to the spouse of somebody who's on those work visas. So obviously the individual can work here in the United States because they're here on a work visa, but their spouse that's coming with them are not eligible to work in the United States. So a lot of people confuse this because they'll say, well, H visas are work visas. Oh, okay. And then someone comes in with an H4 visa, they hire them, and they're having them work for them, and technically they're not eligible to work in the United States. Same thing with the F visas. An F1 visa is an academic visa. That individual is allowed to work here in the United States under their training. That's why they're here. But the F2 visa is for the spouse of that individual, and that individual is unable to work. So again, dependents as well of individuals that are here on different types of work visas like the O visa. You know, obviously the O1 visa is a visa that's eligible to work, but their dependents, which is an H3 visa, is not eligible to work. So again, that's why I share this slide with you, because I see this happen a lot amongst a lot of companies to where there's a common misconception about the types of visas. So use this slide as your reference after today's webinar. So let's talk more about that B1 visa. So some things to understand that you need to know about the B1 visa. So this is obviously a visitor visa. This is a visitor visa for business or pleasure. Some of you may have had individuals come to the United States under a B visa, but I'm telling you it's a non-work visa. When I tell you it's a non-work visa, that means that this individual is not eligible to work here in the United States on a temporary basis. They are allowed to come in for a short-term visit for business. So obviously they are still eligible to receive reimbursements for expenses while they're here visiting. So this visa is intended for maybe your counterparts that are in Greece come here for a week visit. They would be under a B visa. You're obviously allowed to reimburse them for expenses, but you would not be paying them any compensation for while they're here. That does not mean that they're not going to get compensation in their home country. It just means that they will be getting compensation within their, you know, they would get their compensation from their home country, not here in the United States. So I wanted to make sure I clarify that. The first polling question is open, so I'll give you just a second to answer that polling question.